Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Kenya Lambert, and I am the Vice President of Development for the Shriver Center. Welcome to our 2018 Advocacy webinar. To begin, I have three very important housekeeping items to share. If you would like to adjust the size of your presentation relative to the video feed, you can click and drag the gray bar at the center of the screen. Secondly, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the box in the toolbar. We will have time at the end of the webinar to take your questions. And lastly, we plan to record the webinar, and we will distribute the recording later this week. Well, let's begin. It's a really exciting and critical time for advocacy and championing justice in our nation, which is why many of you are on this webinar today. We want to thank you for not only joining us, but also being our partner and investing in the work and fueling the work for so many years. And thank you for helping us to be nimble. Today, we want to create a space to share how we have moved the needle on issues impacting people experiencing poverty. You have been with us on this journey this year and many more, and we would like to share updates from the field. Despite the threats at the federal level, we are on the front lines of resistance, not only reacting to many threats, but also being proactive and anticipating potential threats to come here in our state, and also using our multi-state networks to mobilize other advocacy groups to push positive gains and progress for people in poverty. We have a great program today. Our advocates are fresh from the field with really exciting and important updates to share. To begin, our President John Bowman, who will set the stage for why state advocacy matters, and he will share our advocacy agenda this year. Now I will turn it over to my colleague, John Bowman, and I'll introduce my other colleagues as they come on. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenya. Thank you, everyone, for being in attendance here today and also for supporting this work over the years. We view the advocacy at the state level as of crucial importance, and it's a particular niche of ours. The state level is where things that get done in Washington, D.C. Actually turn into the reality at kitchen tables. For example, the Affordable Care Act some years ago, some criticized it as the biggest federal takeover ever, and yet, which we disagree with, and yet it didn't really become real until the states made dozens and dozens of important decisions about policy, about funding, about all sorts of program design issues. Another set of issues, there's very little federal involvement, such as criminal justice issues. What do you do with people when they re-enter communities from spending time in prison? How do you enforce the civil rights laws? A lot of that depends on decisions made locally. If people in poverty don't sit at those tables, and if they don't have the expert help to sit at those tables, then the decisions aren't good ones, and the process itself isn't fair. So we provide that ourselves here in Illinois across a range of issues, and we provide support for it across the country through our communications, information, the training programs we provide to now people from every state, and the networks we're building that cut across multiple states. So the work we get done here in Illinois actually gets pushed out across the country. And meanwhile, it improves the lives, the quality of life and the quality of opportunity for people in our state. We're coming to you today with a lot of information about the Illinois work because we just concluded this session here. And it's a good example to show you the kinds of impact we can have. I am joined by colleagues who you'll meet later who will go into a deeper dive on some of these things. And the examples I'm about to give you are just a few of the many, a dozen, 13 or so accomplishments we made this year that we'll be sharing a comprehensive list on later in our written communications. But just for purposes of the webinar, here's a few examples. we passed a bill called the COIN Act, which is an acronym that my colleague Dan Lesser will describe in a minute, but essentially is an increase in the welfare grant for the poorest children and families in this state. Now, if you'd have sat down last December or January and thought, how in the world could you even consider asking for a grant increase in a state with such a disastrous budget situation and such a deeply partisan political environment in an election year, with at least one of the parties trying to make political hay by banging on people in poverty? Well, we got it done. And things like that don't happen if it's not your mission to do it and to build the expertise in order to figure out a strategic path for it. Another bill we passed is the Do No Harm Healthcare Bill. In this era of partisan approach to social welfare policy, there are many governors in states controlled by conservatives who are using a waiver process, it's called, in the Medicaid, to undermine the Medicaid program with things like work requirements, higher co-pays, and things that basically just block people in poverty from getting needed health care. The bill we passed introduces a requirement that the governor cannot seek a waiver without the approval of the legislature. And that effectively blocks some of these maverick waiver proposals that have happened in other states. Third accomplishment is an expansion of the Equal Pay Act called the No Salary History Bill. And there we recognize that women in Illinois make 79 cents for every dollar that men make. So anything we can do to improve that by itself will address poverty and will address outcomes for children just by improving the economic status of mothers. This bill essentially forbids employers from asking job applicants for their salary history, which is a device that's been used to just perpetuate the imbalance in salaries. So that sits on the governor's desk, and we'll see if he signs it. Another bill that we'll hear more about in a minute from my colleague Michelle Becchiani-Wiley is Safe Students Trained Officers Bill, which is one of the unique bills in the country requiring training for the police officers that are assigned to schools so that they can be focused on the outcome of keeping kids with behavioral issues in school rather than sending them into the juvenile or the adult criminal justice system. Another example was the FairTax Project in Illinois, which is a work in progress, where we're attempting to amend the Illinois Constitution in order to allow the legislature to pass a progressive income tax. Currently, we have a flat tax. So Dan Lesser, my colleague I mentioned earlier, will also talk to you a little more about that. But let's start with Michelle. My colleague, staff attorney in the community justice program, Michelle Becchiani-Wiley, led the way on a couple of these projects, and turn it over to Michelle. Take it away.
I'm Michelle Becchiani-Wiley. I'm the community justice staff attorney here at the Shriver Center. And we'll start with the Safe Students Trained Officers Bill. This bill actually stemmed from a journey that we had with a school on the Chicago South Side, Hyde Park Academy, in which we interviewed several students, dozens of students, about their interactions with police officers and whether they deemed them as a credible source of safety. We encountered a lot of themes in this project: distrust, fear of law enforcement, not viewing them as someone that they can call if they're in danger. But what we also encountered was this special force, this unique unit that's within the Chicago Police Department known as the School Patrol Unit. And these are officers that are assigned to Chicago Public Schools and permanently stationed inside their schools. Of these officers, we did a little bit more research and found that in our report that we released last year in February, Handcuffs in Hallways, that there are about 248 officers assigned to Chicago Public Schools. Of those officers, 67% have civilian complaints lodged against them. Also, we found that of those officers, they accumulated over $2 million of police misconduct settlements within a 4-year period of time. In conclusion, we found that there was little oversight and absolutely no specialized training for school resource officers assigned to Chicago Public Schools. What was unclear is whether school resource officers at all were required to receive specialized training throughout the state. And we found that in the state of Illinois, unlike the 18 other states in this country, there was no requirement that school resource officers receive specialized training. So our goal was to ensure that Illinois was one of the states, as recommended by the Department of Justice and the Department of Education, to ensure that school resource officers received that specialized training. Our first task was to find out what was the best legislation, what are best practices across the country, and that we relied on our multi-state network, specifically the Texas Appleseed. So in 2016, we reached out to them to ask them about their new legislation that they recently passed that required youth-specific training for school resource officers. They were kind enough to give us their initial draft of legislation along with a fact sheet, and also strongly encouraged us to work with our training and standards board as we approach this session to ensure that the law enforcement community is on board. What the bill does essentially is requires school resource officers to receive youth-specific training, and the Illinois Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board to create a curriculum with organizations with expertise and/or experience in certain topics such as youth adolescent development, educational and administrative issues, youth mental health treatment, juvenile advocacy, and child abuse prevention. It gives the Law Enforcement Training and Standards Board 1 year, and then after that year, from the effective date, police officers that are assigned to schools have an additional year to receive the training. This bill initially had a lot of opposition, but we found that while working with the law enforcement community, as well as the education community, we were able to get this bill passed unanimously through both houses. Another important point about this bill is that it really will have a significant impact on the children of Chicago. In our research, we also found that the lack of training led to instances of police brutality inside schools, specifically that within a 4-year period, there was nearly $250,000 of police misconduct settlements for excessive force on a minor for children. We had a specific incident at Hyde Park Academy in which an officer admitted to slapping a teenage girl in the face. And we strongly believe that had that officer been trained in de-escalation techniques, he would not resort to excessive force on a young child. This also has an impact on the arrests that we see within our schools. CPS reported over 2,000 school-related arrests in the 2013 and 2014 school year. What's important about the training that school resource officers receive is how they can divert children from the criminal justice system as opposed to funneling them into it. What are alternatives to arrest? How to recognize when a child has a disability and they shouldn't be criminalized for a manifestation of a disability, but instead refer to certain social services. This is all things that we hope to work in our next year in working together with law enforcement to create this curriculum once the governor signs this bill. The Shriver Center will have a strong role in creating the curriculum for school resource officers, and we look forward to working with our partners to ensure that we no longer criminalize adolescent behavior and make sure that school is a place where children can learn, be safe, and have access to opportunities such as higher education and housing and not get a criminal record. The second bill that we worked on is the Let People Vote bill, which is a really important bill for people that are currently detained in jail or have a criminal record. This bill has a very interesting history. Last year, in 2016 and 2017, I would spend most of my time inside Cook County Jail registering people to vote. In that process, we found that it was nearly impossible for people in jail to vote without assistance from the Sheriff's Department and the election authority. So what we did initially, before introducing this legislation, is introduce a pilot program inside Cook County Jail in which we would provide in-person voting for the first time in over 10 years. It was a very successful program, and we built very strong relationships with the Chicago Board of Elections, our Cook County Clerk's Office, the Illinois State Board of Elections, as well as the Cook County Department of Corrections. Since this was such a success, we felt like this should be something done throughout the entire state. There are approximately 20,000 people currently in pretrial detention, all who are eligible to vote. There are also 4 million people in the state of Illinois that have a criminal conviction who oftentimes do not realize that they can vote even if they're on parole or probation, or regardless of how many felony convictions they have in their past. So what this bill does has 3 main components. The first component will be the first in the nation's history if the governor signs this bill. it will turn Cook County Jail into a polling station for the purposes of elections. This would mean that Cook County would be the first jail in the United States to actually be an official polling station. This was actually inspired by legislation that came out of Texas that unfortunately did not pass, but they attempted to create a polling station within their largest jail as well. We were inspired by that language and used that language for our own. The second component of the bill is that it will provide that all other counties outside of Cook County, so counties less than 3 million, must coordinate a vote-by-mail program. We were sensitive to the fact that there are smaller counties that do not have the capacity to have a full-out polling station. So we instead are requiring them to have a vote-by-mail program for individuals that are detained in jail. Third and final component addresses that 4 million population of people that have a criminal conviction. Oftentimes in my work inside Cook County Jail, I found that people had no idea that they had the right to vote. They felt that their felony convictions barred them from voting for the rest of their lives. While this may be true in states like Iowa and Florida, this is not true in Illinois. Again, as I stated earlier, if you're on parole or probation, you can vote in this state. And regardless of how many felony convictions you have in your past, you can vote. So what we did in Cook County Jail initially is we would put posters throughout the entire jail informing people of their right to vote. But we felt like there needs to be something statewide to ensure that all people that are leaving the justice system are informed of their right to vote. So the third and final component of the bill requires the Department of Corrections, as well as all jails throughout the state of Illinois, to provide a Know Your Rights voting guide to individuals that are discharged from their custody. This guide is actually being created in partnership with the ACLU of Illinois. We've partnered with them both on this legislation as well as the Know Your Rights voting guide to ensure that it is relevant information for individuals that have formerly been incarcerated to know the right to vote, know how to vote, know where to register, and all other processes related to the election, the voting process. So that was in sum, that bill was a very partisan vote. Unfortunately, in the House, it was 64 votes, and in the Senate as well is fairly partisan. We're unsure of whether the governor will sign it, but that leads me to what you can do to ensure that people have access to the ballot. What you can do is write to the governor in both Springfield, in the Springfield office and the Chicago office to inform them how important that this bill is. That people should not be barred from the polls simply because they can't afford bail to get out of jail. And that all people should be informed of their right to vote in this state. It is a part of the democratic process. And that it is important for all people to know that they have the right to vote and actually be able to exercise that right in the first place. You can also send a letter to the governor informing them about the Safe Students Trained Officers Bill. While we believe that while there's no opposition to this bill, it is always good to be to double check and to contact the governor to inform them the importance of ensuring that we're not criminalizing adolescent behavior, but ensuring that our trained officers are providing safe environments for our students.
Thank you, Michelle. What a powerful description of being able to move the needle and how it impacts children across the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. So thank you so much for your work in helping to interrupt this school to prison pipeline. Also, thank you very much for your work on making sure that over 20,000 individuals will have access to vote. That is very important. Thank you. Now moving on to our Director of Illinois Policy and Economic Justice, Dan Lesser, will share updates on our FairTax Now campaign and the TANF grant increase for thousands in Illinois. Take it away, Dan.
All right, thanks, Kenia. So first of all, the FairTax Now campaign, which involved an effort to amend the Illinois Constitution. Our state constitution requires that the Illinois income tax rate be the same for people of all incomes. So a minimum wage worker pays the same percentage of their income to their state income tax as the two billionaires who are running for governor in Illinois. That's obviously not fair. But when you look at it further, it's even more unfair. And what we've done is look at not just the income tax, the state income tax in isolation, but also in combination with the other major state and local taxes, the property tax and the sales tax. And when you do that, you find that the lowest income people pay more than twice as much or twice a high percentage of their income towards state and local taxes as the highest income taxpayers. So first of all, there's fairness. The other problem is that you don't raise enough revenue when you have a flat tax. Virtually all of the income growth over the last 40 years has occurred at the highest levels, and we're simply not capturing that. And that leads to cuts in services and unpaid back bills, unfunded pension liabilities, and having the worst credit rating of any state in the country of all time, which is what we have at this point. So of major importance to us to get the fair tax, and it became a campaign of the Responsible Budget Coalition, or RBC. The RBC has been around since 2008, 2007, and it's a big tent. Over 300 organizations belong. We have representatives from all the major areas of public that rely on public funding, so pre-K through 12 education, higher education, healthcare, human services, public safety. We've got faith-based groups. We've got, as I said, a large tent that's concerned about state revenue issues and took on this fair tax campaign this year. John Bowman, who you heard from, our president, also chairs the executive committee and has since its inception. So the goal of the fair tax campaign was to amend the Illinois Constitution to allow for a fair tax, also the same thing as a graduated or progressive income tax, where higher income people would pay a higher tax rate and lower income people would pay a lower tax rate. Polling shows a 72% support for having a fair tax, and our colleagues at the Center on Tax and Budget Accountability ran some models that showed you could provide a tax cut to 90% of Illinoisans and still raise $2 billion. So with that, we had a fair amount of momentum, but amending the Constitution is a very difficult task. And that's because in order to even get a resolution on the ballot to amend the Constitution, you need a supermajority vote of 3/5 in both the Illinois House and the Illinois Senate. In order to try and attain that goal, the Shriver Center did a new thing for us, which is we hired a very experienced community organizer who became our state campaign director. And he organized clusters in 7 key areas around the state and then facilitated and supported their work in the districts on elected officials. So he helped them organize in district meetings, town halls, earned media letters to the editor, op-eds. And as I said, it was a new thing for us. We also did the traditional work of the RBC, which is the inside game, working with legislators, providing them with research and analysis, helping out our champions on this. Ultimately, we did not have the votes to get this on the ballot for this November election, but this will continue to be a high priority, not just for the RBC, but for the Shriver Center, because the lack of state funding really threatens everything we care about, every state program we care about. And if a program we support manages to get through the budget process unscathed one year, it's going to be vulnerable the next year. So this will continue to be a top priority for us. A lot will turn on the governor's election. Both candidates have made this a major issue in their campaign. One supports the fair tax, the other one doesn't. If the one who doesn't gets elected, it's going to be hard. If the other one gets elected, it will be easier, but our job in that situation will be to make sure that it remains a top priority to get this done. So that's the Fair Tax Now campaign. I also want to tell you about the COIN Act, the Creating Opportunities for Illinoisans in Need Act, and that involves the TANF program. TANF is the cash assistance program for needy children and their families. It's what's popularly known as welfare, and the welfare grant has to cover all of the family's non-food expenses, so that includes rent, utilities, clothing, personal hygiene products, diapers, transportation, and so on. The TANF grant, the basic TANF cash assistance grant, had not been increased in 10 years. And before that, you have to go back 22 years to see the next increase. So there's only been 2 increases in the last 22 years. And the value of the grant has fallen to 22% of the federal poverty level. In the city of Chicago, a family of 3, a mom and 2 kids, does receive $432 a month and has to cover all those non-food expenses I mentioned. We, working with 2 of our partner organizations, Heartland Alliance and Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, put a bill together, and we worked with Representative Mary Flowers and Senator Manny Hunter. It basically was a plan to increase the TANF grant to 50% of FPL instead of 22% over 3 years. So it would go to 30, then 40, then 50. And we saw this year as an educational year for the legislators to explain to them how low the TANF grants and how much it was there, how important it was to try and increase them. So we moved the bill along, but with the primary goal of getting that education out there and making the members aware and hopefully more sympathetic in the future. The bill passed the Senate on a strictly partisan basis. We got 41 co-sponsors in the House, which is a high number, but it doesn't get you to the 60 votes you need to pass legislation. And we weren't very confident that we had the votes to pass it. And we were very confident that if it did pass the Senate and House, the governor would veto it. So it showed strong support for doing this in the caucus, in the Democratic House caucus, but it wasn't going to get us to the finish line. So separate and apart from pursuing this through a standalone bill, we worked through the budget process. And there was an opening for us because there's been a decline in the TANF caseload, and the governor's proposed budget cut TANF funding by $29 million. Well, in order to do what we wanted to do, which was to increase the grants from 22% to 30% of poverty, that cost about $15 million. So we had an argument that let's take half of those savings from a declining caseload and invest them in raising the grants. So that was kind of the opening we had. We sounded that theme from the first hearing that was held on the governor's proposed budget for next year, and we lobbied the House and the Senate members who were negotiating the budget, and in the end, the House Republicans agreed to put the $15 million in the budget to make it possible to have this TANF grant increase. In fact, we took a vote on the House floor, and there were 20 Republicans who voted in favor, and this was a 35% increase in the amount of the TANF grant. I wouldn't have expected that at the start of session. So the other thing that was the other key point here is that rather than having a freestanding bill that the governor would have the opportunity to veto, the language increasing the TANF grant was put in what's called the BIMP bill, the Budget Implementation Bill. It's a bill that passes along with the budget that implements changes in state programs. So we got the language of our bill for the first year increase put into the BIMP, which the governor had to sign. He had no choice about signing the budget bill that came out. And so there's no opportunity for him to veto this change is done. And so the results are that, as I said, the TANF grants will increase from 22% to 30% of the federal poverty level. What that means for families is that for smaller families of 2 to 3 people, they will get approximately $100 a month more in assistance. For larger families of 4 to 6 people, they will get somewhere between $150 and $250 more per month. A couple of other things that the bill did was to extend, or rather to make the grant uniform. We had slight variances in the amount of grants by what county people lived in. We eliminated that, and so the grants will be the same around the state. And then the other thing we're excited about is because the grant is now pegged to 30% of the federal poverty level, that means that each year, as the poverty level goes up, the grants will go up. So we'll have annual increases in the TANF grant. And so we've accomplished our year 1 goals, and but we still have that year 2 and that year 3 goal out in front of us. We'll be working on that in the future.
Thanks, Dan. Amazing work. It's so nice to see the Shriver Center taking these important steps to build economic stability and mobility. As John mentioned earlier today, state-based advocacy is critical to moving the needle on a massive scale. Our Senior Director of MultiState Networks, Gavin Carney, is here to discuss our Legal Impact Network and one of the emerging issues they're tackling this moment. Gavin?
Thanks, Kenya. So John and Michelle and Dan have talked about some of the ways in which Shriver Center advocates, our partners and lawmakers at the state and local levels, play a vital role in alleviating poverty and advancing racial and economic justice. I want to talk about one of the ways in which we're leveraging that expertise with state and local advocacy and using it to have multi-state and national impact. As you may know, in 2015, the Shriver Center organized the Legal Impact Network, or LIN, a dynamic collaboration of state advocacy leaders who work with communities across the country to end poverty and advance racial justice. Through Lynn, our members connect to share knowledge, tools, and strategies, to align our work around high standards for effective advocacy, including community-driven advocacy and racially just advocacy, and to spearhead collaborative efforts to address threats and advance opportunity for the communities that we serve. Although Lynn is one core part of the Shriver Center's multi-state advocacy, its effectiveness and impact are expanded through collaboration with our Illinois advocates, with our clearinghouse community, our Racial Justice Institute network, and our other multi-state initiatives. Today, I want to focus on one effort that we have underway right now that's grown out of our work with Lynn and other national partners, specifically our work on impending new federal regulations that would punish immigrants should they or their children take advantage of the programs and governmental services designed to advance their well-being. Currently under interagency review is a set of regulations that would dramatically expand what is known as the public charge doctrine of immigration law. Public charge has been a feature of US immigration law since the late 1800s, and public charge, or the doctrine, denies admission and permanent residency to any immigrant who is deemed likely to become a public charge in the future. For the last several decades, federal guidance has basically instructed that a person should be deemed likely to be a public charge if they are primarily dependent upon government services for their subsistence, or if they are likely to become institutionalized on a long-term basis at government expense. So a pretty narrow construction of the public charge doctrine that recognizes that many programs and services offered by the government are beneficial to the long-term well-being of individuals and families and of our communities. The Trump administration is proposing a radical expansion of this doctrine. And although the administration's rules have not been formally published, several drafts have been leaked through the media, including as recently as the end of March. And these leaked drafts reveal an intent to radically expand public charge. The most egregious provisions include a few things. One is a shift away from a focus on primary dependence on government benefits to a focus on whether an immigrant is likely at any time and for any duration to use any government service or program, with a few exclusions. They would also dramatically expand the benefits that are considered. So no longer would it be cash subsistence like what Dan was talking about with respect to TANF, or long-term institutionalization. Now it would include a consideration of whether the immigrant is likely to use healthcare subsidies, is likely to use nutrition assistance, is likely to receive the earned income tax credit, or is likely to use aid targeted at pregnant women, infants, and children, and a host of other federal, state, and local programs as well. Finally, perhaps the most egregious part of the leaked rules is that the public charge doctrine would no longer focus on the immigrant, him or herself. It would also look at that immigrant's dependents and consider whether those dependents have or are likely in the future to use these benefits programs. The mere leaking of these rules has sent a wave of fear through immigrant communities in the US. We're already hearing reports of heightened fear and anxiety amongst families, and we're hearing from agencies that people are disenrolling their children from vital programs like health and nutrition out of fear that this will lead to their parents' deportation and to the destruction of their families. And the potential impact of this is vast. 1 in 4 kids in the US has a foreign-born member of their family, and of these 1 in 4 kids, nearly 100%, about 94%, are actually US citizens. So what we're doing here at the Shriver Center to fight these public charge rules is working with our partners in the Legal Impact Network and others to play a lead role in the campaign to defeat them. Our primary focus currently, both here in Illinois and nationally, is to engage in a broad mobilization of advocates and allies in opposition to the rules, to generate a high volume of high quality comments in opposition to the rules when they're formally published, and to engage in a broad communication strategy that elevates stories about the harm that the threat of these rules is already having and the potential passage of these rules would have in the future. In Illinois, the Shriver Center is one of the lead organizations in what's known as the Protecting Immigrant Families Illinois campaign. The Shriver Center, with its partners, is engaged in broad outreach to stakeholders throughout Illinois, upstate and downstate, to responsibly inform them of the threat of these rules, to help them understand and inform their constituents about what the rules would and wouldn't do in an effort to not unduly contribute to the anxiety and fear that already exists, and to bring people into the campaign to oppose these rules. We're developing a rapid response plan for when the rules are finally published, and we'll use this to guide our efforts to generate a high volume of comments and to generate high quality comments and stories. Nationally, we're taking advantage of the expertise and resources developed here in Illinois and using this to lead legal services organizations across the country in opposition. We're also using our networks, including the clearinghouse community, to raise awareness of the rules. So last month, the clearinghouse community's lead article was an article we co-authored on the impending rules, and that month's advocacy exchange or webinar, which targets the tens of thousands of legal services advocates that are part of our clearinghouse community, focused on the rules and what advocates can do to oppose them. Here at the Shriver Center, we're also playing a lead role with our partners in Lynn and with our other partners in rule analysis and development of strategies to oppose them, both through policy measures, through a public campaign, and through litigation. The potential impact of these rules, the ripple effects that they would have throughout numerous institutions and systems in the US is something that we're seeking to articulate. We're seeking to better understand and identify, and to use this understanding to inform potential litigation strategies and potential communication strategies. The collective goal of the campaign is to defeat the rules, and to do this by generating over 100,000 comments in opposition, and to basically infuse media with compelling stories from credible spokespeople about the harms that these rules will have. The Shriver Center is playing a lead role in making that happen, and we're optimistic that we're going to hit those lofty goals. I'll just finish by talking for a second about what you can do to participate in this effort. One is there is an impending comment period, as I mentioned. As I said, we're also looking to generate as many comments as possible. If you or folks you know you think would be credible voices would be willing to engage in that comment period, we would love to have that happen. The other thing we're looking to do is we're looking to identify allies, including unlikely allies who could be credible spokespeople on the harm that these rules would visit upon families and communities in the US. This can include educators, health service providers, pediatricians, and others. And if you have thoughts or connections to folks that you think might be credible and perhaps unlikely allies in opposing these rules, we'd love to hear about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. And now we will open up this time for question and answers. So please feel free to list your questions in the toolbar on the right side of your screen. To begin, I actually have a few questions, and I would like to start with Gavin. So Gavin, it's hard to believe that families, even before the impending rule has been made, that families are moving away from receiving benefits for themselves and also for their children. So how are advocates preparing for this very real possibility that the new public charge rules of this nature will ultimately be passed?
That's a great question. So there's a few things that we're working on and our partners are working on. One is, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, is credible community education. When these leaked rules came out in the press, there was a wave of fear, and part of that was infused by inaccurate reporting in ethnic media and other outlets about what these rules would do. And so depending on your immigration status, depending upon your long-term plans, these rules will play out differently for different people. We are working to ensure that there's effective knowledge about how these rules would impact individual families, and to ensure that people can make informed decisions about things as important as these vital health, nutrition, and other services that their kids receive. The second piece is we're looking to build networks where we can connect community members and immigrant families to experienced practitioners who can actually help them sort through that individualized assessment. The third thing is working with state agencies who are often the front lines of hearing from community members about their fears, about their concerns, making sure that those agencies understand the rules as well. And these are agencies that wouldn't necessarily have expertise with immigration issues, agencies that administer food stamps, that administer TANF, that administer other programs that generally don't require a nuanced expertise with immigration law.
Thank you so much, Gavin. As we continue to wait for additional questions to come in, I would actually like to move to Dan and the TANF increase. Why do you think that there is so much bipartisan support for this initiative?
Well, I think there was, in part, there was just a genuine understanding. We had a really good witness in committee, but just a genuine understanding of how low the TANF grant is and how impossible it is to get by on that. So I think there were hearts and minds that were changed. There was a lot of resources that went into this campaign, not just us, but Heartland Alliance and Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. So we had a strong coalition. We caught a break in that the two main budget negotiators for the House Democrats and House Republicans are also their leads on human services issues. So they were more steeped in the issue and more inclined to support it. So that helped. And I think there was a spirit of bipartisanship and more of a willingness, I think more of an openness to each other's, the Democrats and Republicans' top priorities. And I think we saw that incorporated into the budget. So I think those were the main factors.
Wonderful. And one of my last questions is for Michelle. How likely or unlikely do you believe that the governor will support the Safe Students Train Officers bill and the Voting in Jails bill?
We spoke with the governor's office, and we believe that they're very likely to support the Safe Students Trained Officers bill. I believe that we're very much on the same page, being that we have no opposition to the bill and that it passed unanimously through both houses. For the Voting in Jails bill, it's very partisan. One of our sponsors is running for lieutenant governor against the governor, and that may lead it to be very partisan. But what we've done is we've worked with, we actually wrote an op-ed that went in Crane that was penned by our sponsor, Representative Stratton. And we're just working to really get the message out to ensure that there's pressure put on the governor to sign this bill, to not be partisan, and to ensure that all people have access to the ballot.
Thanks, Michelle. I am truly honored and really humbled just to work with these team of wonderful advocates. And these are 3 individuals out of a team of 45 individuals here in Chicago and across the nation that is doing work to advance justice and opportunity for people living in poverty. As we close, I would just like to share once again next steps for you. I would just like to say, please ask Governor Ronner to sign the Safe Students, Trained Officers, and Let the People Vote bills. Also visit FairTaxNowIllinois.com and spread the word, not only via email, in person, but also on social media. Stay tuned for news regarding the public charge rule. And lastly, please join us later this month on June 27th at 5 p.m. at the Shriver Center's headquarters at 67 East Madison Street, Suite 2000, for a Take Action Summer Social, where in which we'll have an opportunity to sign postcards to the governor to support all of the bills you've heard today. Once again, thank you so much for your time, your resources, and truly making us nimble to be able to act when called to help people in poverty. Thank you.